It was a Wednesday afternoon in early April, and across the eastern half of the United States, the sky was turning a color that no one wanted to see. In the small city of Xenia, Ohio, nestled about 15 miles southeast of Dayton, the morning had started out warm and humid, unusually so for the first week of April. The air felt thick, heavy with moisture that clung to your skin like a second layer. By lunchtime, the temperature had climbed into the mid-70s, and the wind had begun to stir. It was not the gentle spring breeze that people in the Miami Valley were used to. It was a restless, gusty wind that seemed to come from every direction at once, rattling windows and sending loose papers skittering across the parking lots of downtown Xenia. At the United States Weather Bureau in Dayton, meteorologists were watching the radar screens with growing concern. They had been tracking a powerful storm system that had been brewing since early morning across the Great Plains. By noon, it had spawned tornadoes in Illinois and Indiana, and now it was marching eastward into Ohio. The conditions were perfect for a major outbreak. A strong low-pressure system was pulling warm, moist air up from the Gulf of Mexico while a cold front sliced down from Canada, and the collision of those two air masses was creating a volatile atmosphere. The cap, that lid of warm air that sometimes suppresses thunderstorms, had broken early that afternoon, and all across the Ohio River Valley, supercells were exploding into the sky like angry fists. In Xenia, most people were going about their ordinary routines. Kids were still in school, their minds already wandering toward the end of the day. Parents were at work or at home or running errands. The city itself was a typical Midwestern town of about 27,000 people, with a neat downtown square, a courthouse, a few churches, and neighborhoods full of old trees and frame houses. It was the kind of place where everybody knew somebody, where the high school football games packed the stands on Friday nights, and where the biggest news story of the year so far had been a heated city council meeting about a proposed shopping center. But the weather was about to change everything. At around 3:30 p.m., the National Weather Service in Dayton issued a tornado watch for western Ohio. That meant conditions were favorable for tornadoes to develop. It was not a warning, not yet. A watch meant be alert, be ready. Many people heard the announcement on their car radios or over the intercom at their workplaces. Some glanced at the sky and saw nothing but a gray, lumpy overcast. Others felt a slight unease but carried on. In Xenia, a few families who had been through tornado scares before began to pay closer attention to the radio. At 4:20 p.m., the Weather Bureau upgraded the watch to a warning for a severe thunderstorm that had been tracked moving east-northeast across Greene County. The storm was showing signs of rotation on radar, a telltale hook echo that meteorologists had learned to recognize as the signature of a potential tornado. The warning was broadcast on local radio stations, and dispatchers at the Greene County Sheriff's Office began calling communities along the storm's path. But the call to Xenia came late, and by the time the warning reached the city, the storm was already on top of them. The sky turned a peculiar shade of green, what some witnesses would later describe as the color of a bad bruise. And then the hail came. First it was small, the size of peas, but within minutes the hailstones grew to the size of golf balls, then to the size of baseballs. They pounded the rooftops and the streets, shattering car windows and tearing holes in awnings. The noise was deafening, a continuous drumming that drowned out everything else. People rushed to windows to see what was happening, and what they saw made their blood run cold. To the southwest, the clouds were doing something they had never seen before. A low, black base was lowering, rotating slowly, and from it a funnel cloud began to descend. It did not drop all at once. It seemed to reach down tentatively, like a finger testing the air. Then it touched the ground, and in that instant the world changed. The tornado that struck Xenia on April 3, 1974, was classified as an F5 on the Fujita scale, the highest rating possible. Its winds were estimated at more than 260 miles per hour. It was more than a half-mile wide at times, a monstrous column of debris that churned across the landscape with a roar that survivors compared to 1,000 freight trains or the sound of a jet engine right next to your ear. It touched down just west of the city limits, near the intersection of U.S. Route 35 and Ohio Route 68, and then it plowed straight into the heart of Xenia. The first structures to be hit were homes on the west side of town. The tornado ripped them apart as if they were made of matchsticks. Entire houses were lifted off their foundations and tossed into the air, spinning and disintegrating. Cars were rolled across fields like toys. Trees were snapped off at the trunk or uprooted entirely. People who were outside at that moment or who were in their cars trying to get home had no time to run. The debris cloud was so dense, so filled with flying lumber, glass, and metal, that it was impossible to see more than a few feet. Some people were picked up by the wind and carried hundreds of yards before being slammed into the ground. At Xenia High School, classes were just letting out for the day. Students were waiting for buses or walking to their cars when they heard the roar. A teacher looked to the west and saw the tornado coming, a dark, rotating wall of destruction that filled the horizon. She screamed for everyone to get inside to get to the basement. Kids ran, some crying, some frozen in shock. The tornado missed the high school by only a few blocks, but the wind from the outer circulation still shattered windows in the building and sent lockers flying across hallways. Further east, the tornado hit the downtown area. The Greene County Courthouse, a stately limestone building with a tall clock tower, took a direct hit. The clock stopped at 4:41 p.m., a time that would become seared into the memory of the community. The roof was torn off, the upper floors collapsed, and the courtroom on the second floor was destroyed. Debris from the courthouse, including heavy pieces of stone, was scattered across the square. The Xenia City Hall, the post office, and dozens of businesses along Main Street were either heavily damaged or completely leveled. At the same time, the tornado was tearing through the residential neighborhoods of Arrowhead and North Xenia. In one subdivision, a young mother named Mary had just brought her 2 children home from school. She heard the warning on the radio and ran to the basement, pulling her kids with her. She had just closed the basement door when the tornado hit. She later said that the house above her made a sound like a giant hand was crushing it, a long, grinding, tearing noise that went on and on. When the wind finally died down, she pushed open the basement door and found that the entire upper floor of her home was gone. The sky was directly overhead. She could see pieces of her neighbor's house in the trees. The tornado continued its path of destruction through the eastern part of town, across the Little Miami River and into the countryside. Along its path, it struck the Arrowhead Mobile Home Park, where the devastation was total. Mobile homes are especially vulnerable to tornadoes, and here, dozens of them were completely destroyed. Many people were killed in that park, families who had no basement, no shelter, no place to hide. The chaos was overwhelming. In the midst of the disaster, there were stories of incredible survival and heartbreaking loss. A man named Tom was driving home from work when he saw the tornado coming. He pulled his car over and ran to a nearby house where he found a family huddled in a closet. The tornado tore the roof off the house and pulled the walls apart, but they all survived. Another man, a volunteer firefighter, was at the station when the sirens went off. He ran to his truck and drove toward the storm, but he never made it. His body was found 2 days later in a field a mile away. The tornado cut a swath of destruction that was over 30 miles long. In Xenia alone, 32 people were killed, more than 1,300 people were injured, over 1,200 homes were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The downtown area was in ruins. The entire city was without power, without water, without phone service. The roads were blocked by debris, and emergency responders had to pick their way through the wreckage on foot. As dusk fell, a strange quiet settled over the city. The storm had passed, but the aftermath was just beginning. People wandered through the rubble, calling out for missing family members, tripping over broken boards and shattered glass. The air smelled of gasoline and natural gas, of wet plaster and torn earth. Sirens wailed from every direction. And in the darkness, without streetlights or house lights, the only illumination came from fires still burning in the ruins and the headlights of cars that had been flipped on their sides. That night, the National Weather Service confirmed that the Xenia tornado was part of a much larger outbreak. Across the Midwest and the South, 148 tornadoes had touched down in a span of 18 hours, killing more than 300 people and injuring thousands. It was the worst tornado outbreak in American history up to that time, but for the people of Xenia, the statistics meant nothing. They had lost their homes, their neighbors, their sense of safety. They had lived through the storm, and now they had to live through the days that followed. In the weeks and months after April 3, 1974, Xenia would rebuild. The community came together in a way that stunned even the most cynical observers. Volunteers arrived from all over Ohio and beyond, bringing food, water, clothing, and tools. The National Guard set up tents in the parks. FEMA established disaster relief centers. Churches opened their doors as shelters and soup kitchens. The high school, which had escaped the worst of the storm, became a command center for the recovery effort, but the memory of that day never faded. The survivors would always remember the green sky, the hail, the roar, and the silence that followed. They would remember the faces of the missing, the funerals, the long days of sifting through the rubble for anything that could be salvaged. And they would remember the way the clock on the courthouse tower had stopped at 4:41 p.m., a frozen moment in time that marked the dividing line between the world before the tornado and the world after. Tonight, we are going to tell the story of the Xenia tornado of 1974. We will walk through the hours leading up to the storm, the minutes of destruction, and the years of recovery. We will hear from the people who were there, the ones who lost everything and the ones who found a way to go on. This is not just a story about a weather event. It is a story about a community, about resilience, about how a town can be torn apart and then put back together piece by the hands of its own people. It began as so many disasters do, with a sky that looked wrong. April 3, 1974 started out like any other spring day in the Miami Valley. The sun rose through a thin overcast and the air was calm. By mid-morning, the temperature was climbing and the humidity was rising. Farmers in the fields around Xenia noticed that the cattle were acting restless, pacing and snorting for no apparent reason. Birds had stopped singing. The atmosphere seemed to be holding its breath. At the Xenia Municipal Building, the city manager and the chief of police held a brief meeting about storm preparations. They had heard the weather forecast, which mentioned the possibility of severe thunderstorms, but they had no idea of the scale of what was coming. The National Weather Service's warning network was not what it is today. There were no Doppler radars, no satellite images, no cell phone alerts. The best they had were teletype machines that printed out bulletins from the Weather Bureau and a handful of volunteer storm spotters who would call in to report what they saw. One of those spotters was a man named Don, a retired farmer who lived on the western edge of town. He had been watching the sky since noon, and by 3:30 p.m. he was convinced that something terrible was brewing. He saw the clouds building to the southwest, towering cumulonimbus with flat anvil tops that spread out like a canopy. He saw the lowering cloud base, the rotation within it. He picked up his phone and called the sheriff's office. The dispatcher thanked him and said they would notify the public, but the public was not notified in time. At 4:15 p.m., Don saw the funnel touch down. He later said it was like watching a giant black rope descend from the sky and begin to writhe across the ground. He watched for a moment, frozen, and then he ran to his storm cellar. He heard the roar building, felt the ground shake, and then the tornado passed a quarter-mile south of his house. He survived, but he would never forget the sight of homes being peeled open like cans. Inside the city, people were beginning to sense that something was wrong. The wind had picked up dramatically, whipping tree branches and trash through the streets. The sky had turned from gray to a sickly greenish yellow. And then, like a sledgehammer, the hail began. It came down so hard that it broke the windshield of a police cruiser parked on Main Street. The officer inside ducked down, covering his head as the ice balls smashed through the glass. The tornado itself was still a few minutes away, but its outer winds were already causing destruction. Signs were torn from buildings, awnings ripped from storefronts, and cars shunted sideways across the pavement. People who were outside ran for cover, some into stores, some into cars, some into doorways. A woman named Ruth was walking home from the grocery store when the hail started. She ran to the nearest building, which happened to be the Xenia Public Library. She pushed through the doors just as the lights flickered and went out. The librarian told everyone to go to the basement. Ruth and a dozen others huddled in the basement of the library, listening to the roar that grew louder and louder until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The library was on the edge of the tornado's path. It sustained heavy damage, but it did not collapse. When Ruth emerged after the storm had passed, she found that the entire block to the west had been leveled. The street was gone, replaced by a tangle of debris that looked like a giant had kicked over a pile of lumber. She could not find her house. She could not even find the street her house had been on, and so it went all across Xenia. In the space of a few minutes, the tornado had rewritten the map of the city. Landmarks were gone, neighborhoods erased, lives turned upside down. The storm did not discriminate. It destroyed rich neighborhoods and poor ones, old homes and new businesses and churches. It took the roof off the high school and smashed the windows of the fire station. It flipped a dozen railroad cars off their tracks and threw a school bus into a pond. The recovery would take years. But the story of the Xenia tornado is not just a story of destruction. It is also a story of the human spirit. In the days that followed, neighbors who had never spoken to each other before were sharing food and water. Strangers drove from hundreds of miles away to help. The power grid was restored in stages, and as each block got its lights back, people cheered. The kids went back to school in temporary buildings. The downtown was rebuilt and the courthouse clock tower was repaired. The clock still works today, and every year at 4:41 p.m. on April 3, the city pauses to remember. This is the story of that day and the days after. We are going to take you back to the spring of 1974, to a town that faced the worst that nature could throw at it and refused to be beaten. We will talk to the survivors, the first responders, the volunteers. We will hear about the fear, the loss, and the courage. And we will understand why more than 50 years later, the Xenia tornado remains one of the most powerful and haunting events in American history. The opening chapter of that story is the sky itself, and the weather, and the caution that was too little, too late. But before we can understand how the tornado struck, we have to understand the people it struck. So let us begin at the beginning with an ordinary Wednesday, in a city that had no idea that its world was about to be torn apart. The morning of April 3, 1974 began quietly in Xenia, Ohio, with the kind of stillness that often precedes a storm. The sun rose through a thin haze, casting a pale light over the city. Main Street was coming to life as shopkeepers unlocked their doors and residents began their daily routines. At the Woolworths on Detroit Street, the soda fountain was already busy with customers ordering coffee and donuts. The barber on Green Street was sharpening his straight razor, listening to the radio as it played a mix of news and music. The sky was a dull gray, but no one paid it much mind. Spring in Ohio meant unpredictable weather, and today seemed no different from any other overcast Wednesday. But across the state, the atmosphere was gathering energy. A massive low-pressure system was moving up from the Mississippi Valley, pulling warm, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico and colliding it with a cold front sweeping down from Canada. The ingredients for violent storms were all in place. At the National Weather Service offices, forecasters were watching the data with growing concern. By early afternoon, they had issued a severe thunderstorm watch for a large part of the Midwest, including Ohio, but watches were common in spring and most people hardly blinked. In Xenia, the temperature climbed into the 70s, unusually warm for April. The humidity grew oppressive. By 2 o'clock, the sky had turned a darker shade of gray, and the clouds were beginning to build upward into towering masses. The wind picked up, gusting from the southwest. Children playing in schoolyards noticed the air felt strange, heavy, and charged. Some said it smelled like wet metal. Dogs began to whine and pace. At the Greene County Courthouse, the old clock tower stood like a silent sentinel, its hands moving steadily toward the moment that would freeze it in time. At the Xenia Daily Gazette, the editor was putting together the afternoon edition. He had heard the storm warnings on the police scanner, but there was no sense of alarm. Reporters were out covering city council meetings and high school sports. One young photographer named Dale was in the darkroom developing film when the lights flickered. He stepped out into the newsroom and saw the sky outside the windows had turned an eerie shade of green. He grabbed his camera and walked to the front door, thinking he might get a picture of the storm clouds. What he saw stopped him cold. A massive, rotating cloud was bearing down on the city from the southwest, looking like something out of a nightmare. He ran back inside and shouted for everyone to get to the basement. At the Xenia High School, classes were just letting out for the day. Students were streaming through the hallways, laughing and talking when the intercom crackled to life. The principal's voice came over the speakers, urging everyone to take cover immediately. A few teachers had heard the tornado warning on a portable radio, but they did not have time to explain. The students were herded into the interior hallways, told to kneel down and cover their heads. Many thought it was a drill. Then the lights went out and the roar began. The tornado touched down just south of the city limits, near the intersection of State Route 42 and US 35. It was a violent wedge-shaped funnel, more than half a mile wide at its base, moving northeast at nearly 50 miles per hour. The first structure it struck was a farmhouse belonging to the Burkhalls family. The house was lifted off its foundation and thrown into a nearby field, splintering into 1,000 pieces. The family huddled in the basement, miraculously unhurt, but when they emerged, they found nothing but open sky where their home had been. The tornado continued its path, crossing the Little Miami River, pulling water up into its vortex and turning the funnel a sickly brown. Inside the city limits, the first sign of the tornado's approach was a sound like a freight train amplified 1,000 times. It was a deep, grinding roar that vibrated through the ground and into people's bones. The hail had stopped, replaced by a sudden, eerie calm. Then the wind returned with a fury that defied description. The pressure dropped so rapidly that eardrums popped and windows exploded outward. The tornado was upon Xenia. At the intersection of Detroit Street and Green Street, the tornado tore through the heart of downtown. It ripped the roof off the Lafayette Hotel, sending bricks and timber flying through the air like shrapnel. The old Opera House, which had stood for nearly a century, collapsed into a pile of rubble. The fire station on Church Street lost its entire front wall, and a fire truck was lifted and flipped onto its side. The tornado grabbed a gasoline station at the corner of Main and King, wrapping its metal canopy around a tree 2 blocks away. One of the most harrowing stories from that moment comes from a woman named Betty, who was driving home from work when she saw the funnel descending. She pulled her car to the side of the road and ran for a nearby church. She made it inside just as the stained glass windows shattered. She huddled under a pew, covering her head with her arms. The sound was deafening, a constant roar punctuated by the crash of collapsing walls and the shrieking of torn metal. She later said that she prayed not for her own safety but for her children, who were in a school on the other side of town. When the tornado passed, she ran out into a world that no longer looked like her city. The church was still standing, but the street was gone. She had to climb over piles of debris to find her way. She walked for hours until she reached the school, only to find that the building was still there, though heavily damaged. Her children were safe in the gymnasium, covered in dust but unharmed. At the junior high school on West Market Street, the tornado hit with such force that it lifted the roof off the building and tossed it into the parking lot. Students and teachers were trapped under fallen beams and collapsed walls. Rescue efforts began immediately, with neighbors rushing to the scene with crowbars and bare hands. They dug through the wreckage, pulling out children one by one. One teacher, a woman named Margaret, used her own body to shield a group of students under a desk. When the storm passed, she was found unconscious but still alive, and the students beneath her were safe. She later received a commendation for her bravery, but she always said she did not think about it. She just did what any teacher would do. The tornado continued its path of destruction through the residential neighborhoods. On North King Avenue, entire blocks of houses were reduced to piles of kindling. A row of new townhomes that had just been completed was flattened as if by a giant hand. Cars were thrown into trees, wrapped around telephone poles, and stacked on top of each other. A school bus was picked up and deposited upside down in a pond, its passengers miraculously escaping with only minor injuries. The tornado seemed to have a mind of its own, sparing some homes while destroying others right next door. One survivor, a man named Tom, was in his living room watching television when the power went out. He looked out the window and saw the funnel cloud approaching. He yelled for his wife and children to get into the basement. They made it down the stairs just as the house began to shake. The noise was so loud that he could not hear his own screams. He held his family in his arms as the house disintegrated above them. When it was over, they crawled out of the basement to find that their home was gone. Everything they owned was scattered across the neighborhood, but they were alive. Tom looked around and saw that his neighbor's house was still standing, untouched. It was a strange and cruel randomness that would haunt him for years. As the tornado moved northeast, it left a trail of devastation that was almost incomprehensible. In the space of about 15 minutes, it had destroyed or damaged more than half the structures in Xenia. The death toll would eventually reach 33, with hundreds injured. The property damage was estimated at over $100 million, a staggering sum in 1974. But the true cost was measured in lives broken, in families torn apart, in a community shattered. And yet, even as the storm raged, acts of heroism were unfolding. A postal worker named Robert was delivering mail when he saw the tornado bearing down. He abandoned his truck and ran into a nearby house where he found an elderly woman frozen with fear. He dragged her into the basement just as the roof was ripped away. They survived together, holding onto a water pipe until the winds subsided. Robert later became a local hero, but he shrugged off the attention, saying he only did what anyone would have done. At the Xenia Municipal Building, the city manager and the police chief were in a small interior room when the tornado struck. They had been trying to coordinate a warning, but the telephone lines went dead and the radio tower collapsed. They huddled in the dark as the building swayed around them. When they emerged, they saw that the entire downtown was in ruins. Without hesitation, they began organizing rescue efforts, using bullhorns and messengers on foot because no communication system was left. The first outsiders to arrive were the State Highway Patrol and the Ohio National Guard, who were already on alert because of the widespread outbreaks across the state. They set up roadblocks to keep out the curious and began coordinating search and rescue. Helicopters flew overhead, assessing the damage and looking for survivors. Ambulances from neighboring towns came as quickly as they could, navigating debris-strewn roads. But the real heroes were the neighbors. In the minutes and hours after the tornado, ordinary people became first responders. They dug through rubble with their bare hands, listening for cries for help. They carried the injured to makeshift triage centers set up in parking lots and churches. They shared food and water, and they comforted the grieving. A woman named Helen opened her basement to a dozen strangers, giving them blankets and hot coffee. A man named George used his pickup truck to transport the wounded to the hospital, making trip after trip until the truck ran out of gas. The hospital itself was overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, treating everything from minor cuts to severe head injuries. The lobby was filled with the injured, the dead, and the frantic. Volunteers brought food and supplies from surrounding counties. The Red Cross set up a disaster relief center at the high school, which had survived with only minor damage. They distributed food, clothing, and medical supplies, and they provided a place for people to report missing loved ones. As night fell, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The power was out across most of the city, and the darkness was punctuated only by the headlights of rescue vehicles and the flickering of gas lamps. The air was thick with dust and the smell of natural gas from broken pipelines. The sound of chainsaws and heavy equipment echoed through the streets as crews began the long task of clearing debris. The National Guard set up a curfew to prevent looting, though there was little to steal. Most of what people owned was buried under piles of wreckage. The survivors gathered in small groups, sharing stories and helping each other. Many had lost everything, but they found strength in each other. A young couple whose house was destroyed spent the night in the back of their pickup truck wrapped in blankets. They watched the stars come out, a rare sight in a city normally bright with streetlights. They talked about rebuilding, about the future, about the baby they were expecting. They refused to let the tornado take their hope. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and grief. Funerals were held for the 33 who had died, sometimes multiple services in a single day. The first funerals were small, private affairs, but soon community memorials were organized. A memorial service was held at the ruins of the Opera House, where hundreds gathered to pray and to remember. The governor attended along with state officials. They promised aid and they kept their promise, but no amount of money could bring back the lives that were lost. The recovery effort was massive. Volunteers arrived by the busload from all over Ohio and beyond. They came from churches, from colleges, from civic groups. They brought rakes and shovels and hammers. They brought food and water and clothes. They helped clear debris, salvage belongings, and begin the slow process of rebuilding. The Red Cross and the Salvation Army set up mobile kitchens that served thousands of meals a day. The National Guard provided security and logistical support. FEMA, which had been created only a few years earlier, sent teams to assess the damage and coordinate federal assistance. But the most important work was done by the people of Xenia themselves. They formed neighborhood committees to organize recovery efforts. They shared tools and labor, and they looked out for each other. A woman whose house was spared opened her home to a family whose house was destroyed. A man with a bulldozer spent days clearing roads without being asked. The high school students organized a fund drive that raised thousands of dollars. The community that had been torn apart was pulling itself back together. The rebuilding took years. The downtown was reconstructed with new buildings, updated codes, and a renewed sense of purpose. The courthouse clock tower was repaired and the clock started running again. On the first anniversary of the tornado, a memorial was dedicated in the park where the library once stood. Survivors gathered to remember, to cry, and to celebrate their resilience. The names of the 33 who died were read aloud, and a moment of silence was observed at exactly 4:41 p.m. The tornado changed Xenia forever. It changed the way people thought about weather, about community, about life itself. Many survivors later said that the experience made them appreciate every day, every hug, every moment of peace. They learned that material possessions are replaceable, but people are not. They learned that when the worst happens, the best in humanity can emerge. Today, Xenia is a thriving city, but the memory of April 3rd, 1974 remains a part of its identity. Old-timers still talk about the green sky and the roar. They point to photographs in the museum showing the twisted metal and the shattered buildings. They tell stories to their grandchildren about the night the earth shook and the sky fell. And every year as the anniversary approaches, the city pauses. The sirens are tested, the schools hold drills, and the survivors gather to remember. The clock on the courthouse tower still reads 4:41, a frozen reminder of the moment that defined a generation. But there is more to this story than the destruction and the recovery. There is the story of the weather itself, the massive storm system that spawned the Xenia tornado and dozens of others that same day. The outbreak of April 3, 1974 was one of the largest and most violent in American history. It produced over 140 tornadoes across 13 states, killing more than 300 people and causing billions of dollars in damage. Xenia was just one stop on a path of devastation that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. In the hours before the tornado struck, the atmospheric conditions were nearly perfect for violent storms. A strong jet stream, a deep low-pressure center, and abundant moisture combined to create an environment that could produce supercell thunderstorms capable of long-track tornadoes. The National Weather Service had issued warnings, but the technology of the time was primitive. Radar coverage was sparse, and forecasters relied on spotter reports and luck. Many communities received little or no warning. In Xenia, the warning came just minutes before the tornado hit, and by then it was too late for some. The tornado that struck Xenia was rated an F5 on the Fujita scale, the highest category of tornado intensity. It had winds estimated at over 300 miles per hour, and it left a path of destruction nearly a mile wide and 20 miles long. It was not the deadliest tornado of the outbreak. That title belongs to the tornado that struck Brandenburg, Kentucky, killing 31. But it was one of the most infamous, largely because of the ferocity of its destruction and the size of the community it hit. In the aftermath of the outbreak, many changes were made to the way tornado warnings were issued. The National Weather Service improved its radar network, developed better communication systems, and launched public education campaigns. The Xenia tornado became a case study in disaster preparedness and response, and lessons learned from that day have saved countless lives in the years since. But for the people of Xenia, the statistics and the science are secondary. What they remember is the sound, the fear, the loss, and the love. They remember the strangers who became friends, the neighbors who became family, and the city that refused to die. They remember that even in the darkest hour there was light. And so we continue our journey through that day, diving deeper into the stories of the people who lived it. We will meet the rescue workers who dug through the rubble, the survivors who lost everything, the volunteers who gave their time, and the children who grew up with the storm as a defining memory. We will explore the long, hard road to recovery, and we will see how Xenia rebuilt not just its buildings but its soul. The story of the Xenia tornado is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It is a reminder that nature is powerful beyond comprehension, but that the bonds of community are even stronger. It is a story of sorrow and hope, of destruction and creation, of a town that was broken and then put back together by the hands of its own people. We are only at the beginning of this story. There is so much more to tell. The sun is setting on that terrible day, but the night is long and the work has just begun. The people of Xenia are gathering in the ruins, counting their blessings and their losses and deciding that they will not give up. They will rebuild, they will remember, and they will endure. But endurance is not a single act, it is a daily choice made by each survivor. In the weeks and months after the tornado, the people of Xenia faced decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. Some decided to leave, unable to bear the sight of the ruins or the weight of the memories. They moved to other towns, other states, hoping to start over somewhere the sky did not hold such terror. But most stayed. They stayed because this was home, because their roots ran deep, because they refused to let a storm define them. They stayed because of a quiet, stubborn faith that the place they loved could be loved again. Among those who stayed was a young couple named Mark and Linda. They had been married less than a year when the tornado hit. Their apartment above a hardware store was completely destroyed. They lost everything: furniture, clothes, photographs, wedding gifts. But they had each other, and they had their cat, a tabby named Mabel, who had hidden under the bed during the worst of it. They found her the next morning, covered in dust but alive. For Mark and Linda, that cat was a symbol of survival. They lived with Linda's parents for the next 6 months, saving every penny to rent a new place. Mark worked double shifts at a factory that had been spared, while Linda volunteered at the Red Cross shelter. They rebuilt their lives slowly, piece by piece. Years later, they would tell their children that the tornado taught them what really mattered: not things, but people. There was also the story of Old Man Thompson, a widower in his 70s who had lived in the same house on South Detroit Street for 50 years. His house was one of the few on his block that survived with only minor damage. But his neighbor's house was gone, and the neighbor's wife had died. Thompson took the neighbor into his home, shared his meals, and helped him sift through the rubble for anything salvageable. They became unlikely friends, bound together by grief and gratitude. Thompson had lost his wife 10 years earlier, and he knew that silence could be as cruel as any storm. So he talked and he listened, and he made sure the neighbor did not spend his nights alone. That kind of quiet heroism happened all over Xenia, in hundreds of small acts that never made the news. The children of Xenia carried the storm with them in ways that adults sometimes forgot. Many had been at school when the tornado struck, huddled in hallways and basements while the world howled outside. For weeks afterward, the slightest change in weather could send them into a panic. A dark cloud, a sudden gust of wind, the sound of rain on the roof, all could trigger memories of that terrible afternoon. Schools brought in counselors to help the children process their fear. Art teachers asked students to draw pictures of what they had seen. The drawings were heartbreaking: twisted houses, flying cars, people running. But they were also therapeutic. By putting their nightmares on paper, the children began to reclaim a sense of control. One little girl, Sarah, drew a picture of a tree. It was a simple tree, tall and green, with a swing hanging from a branch. In the background, the sun was shining. When her teacher asked why she drew that, Sarah said, "Because after the tornado, I saw a tree that was still standing, and it had leaves. It was the most beautiful thing I ever saw." That tree became a symbol for many in Xenia, a reminder that even after devastation, life finds a way to continue. Sarah's picture was published in the local newspaper, and copies were hung in homes and businesses across town. The long process of rebuilding brought its own challenges. Insurance claims were filed by the thousands, and adjusters worked around the clock to process them. There were disputes over coverage, delays in payments, and accusations of fraud. Some contractors swooped in, offering quick repairs at inflated prices, preying on desperate homeowners. The city formed a task force to vet contractors and protect residents from scams. It was a frustrating, exhausting process, but the community held together. Neighbors helped neighbors argue with insurance companies. Lawyers volunteered their time. The city council passed temporary ordinances to speed up building permits and waive fees. Construction crews worked through the summer and into the fall. By winter, many homes had roofs again, though windows were still covered with plywood and walls were bare studs. The sound of hammers and saws became the soundtrack of Xenia. It was a sound of hope. The high school, which had been destroyed, was rebuilt using the latest safety standards. It reopened in time for the next school year, a modern building with reinforced classrooms and a tornado shelter. The school board voted to name the new gymnasium in honor of the students who had organized the relief fund. Their names were etched on a plaque near the entrance, a permanent tribute to their leadership. The downtown area took longer to rebuild. The Opera House, the courthouse, the library, these had been more than just buildings. They were landmarks, repositories of history and identity. The city debated whether to reconstruct the Opera House exactly as it was or to build something new. In the end, they chose a compromise, a new cultural center that incorporated salvaged elements from the old building. The original cornerstone was preserved and placed in the lobby. The new building opened its doors in 1976, a symbol of Xenia's bicentennial spirit. It hosted concerts, plays, and community events, and it became a gathering place once again. The courthouse, too, was restored. The clock tower was rebuilt, and a new clock mechanism was installed. But the hands were left at 4:41, frozen in time. It was not a technical oversight, but a deliberate choice. The city council voted to keep the clock stopped as a memorial to the moment the tornado struck. Tourists would come to see it, and locals would glance at it with a mix of sadness and pride. It became one of the most photographed landmarks in Ohio. Every April 3rd, the city held a ceremony at the tower. Survivors would gather, hold candles, and listen to the names of the dead read aloud. The clock never changed, but the city around it did. The tornado also changed the way Xenia approached emergency preparedness. The city invested in a new siren system, one that could be heard in every neighborhood. Schools conducted regular tornado drills. The fire department trained volunteers to serve as storm spotters. A community emergency response team was formed with members trained in first aid, search and rescue, and communication. When the next severe weather season came, Xenia was ready. In subsequent years, the sirens would sound many times, but no tornado would ever again catch the city unprepared. Nationally, the outbreak of April 3, 1974 prompted a revolution in tornado science. The National Weather Service expanded its network of Doppler radar stations, which could detect rotation in clouds before tornadoes formed. Forecasters developed new techniques for predicting where storms would hit and how strong they would be. The Fujita scale was refined and public warning systems were overhauled. The term tornado watch and tornado warning became standard, and the public was educated about the difference. In the decades that followed, the number of tornado deaths dropped dramatically, even as the number of tornadoes remained steady. The lessons of Xenia and the other communities hit that day saved lives across the country. But the true legacy of the Xenia tornado is not in the science or the policy. It is in the stories passed down from generation to generation. Grandparents tell their grandchildren about the green sky and the roar. They describe the sound of the train that never came, the moment when the air pressure dropped and their ears popped. They talk about the stranger who carried them to safety, the neighbor who shared their food, the friend who held their hand in the dark. These stories are a form of memory, a way of keeping the past alive. They remind the young that nature is powerful and unpredictable, but that people are capable of extraordinary kindness. As the years passed, the scars of the tornado faded but never disappeared. A few empty lots remained where houses once stood, never rebuilt. Some families chose to leave those lots as green spaces, planting gardens or trees in memory of loved ones. Walking through those neighborhoods, you could still feel the weight of what had been lost. But you could also feel the resilience. The trees that had been stripped bare grew new branches. The gardens bloomed each spring. The children who had huddled in basements became parents themselves, and they taught their own children how to take shelter, how to help a neighbor, how to face the storm with courage. By the 1990s, Xenia was once again a vibrant city. New businesses had opened, new homes had been built, and the population had grown. The tornado was no longer the only thing people talked about, but it was still part of the city's identity. The museum downtown had a permanent exhibit dedicated to April 3, 1974. Visitors could see photographs of the destruction, watch news footage, and read survivor accounts. There was a display of twisted metal and shattered bricks, a reminder of the storm's power. And there was a section devoted to the recovery, the volunteers, the donations, the rebuilding. It was a story of tragedy, yes, but also of triumph. In the year 2000, the city held a special ceremony to mark the 26th anniversary. Survivors gathered once again at the courthouse. The clock still read 4:41. A local choir sang and a minister led a prayer. Then a young woman stepped to the microphone. She was Sarah, the girl who had drawn the picture of the tree. She was now a mother herself with 2 children of her own. She spoke about what the tornado had taught her, that life is fragile, that love is precious, that community is everything. She said, "The tornado took things from us, but it gave us something too, it gave us each other." There was not a dry eye in the crowd, and so the story of the Xenia tornado continues. It continues in the memories of the survivors, in the records of the National Weather Service, in the pages of history books. It continues in the way people look at the sky on a spring afternoon, the way they listen for the siren, the way they hold their children a little tighter when the wind begins to blow. It continues in the quiet acts of kindness that happen every day, the small gestures that bind a community together. The clock on the courthouse tower still reads 4:41. It is a reminder of a moment that changed everything. But it is also a reminder that time does not stop. Life goes on, the sun rises again, the city rebuilds, the children grow, the stories are told, and the people of Xenia, Ohio endure. That is the heart of this story. Not the destruction, but the rebuilding, not the fear, but the courage, not the loss, but the love. The tornado came and went, but the spirit of Xenia remained, and it remains still in the hearts of all who call that city home. On a warm spring evening in 2024, the city will mark the 50th anniversary of the tornado. Survivors and their descendants will gather once more at the courthouse. The clock will still show 4:41. There will be speeches and songs and moments of silence. But there will also be laughter, because the people of Xenia have learned that joy and grief can coexist. They will remember the 33 who died, but they will also celebrate the thousands who lived, the community that survived, the city that rose from the rubble. And when the ceremony ends, people will walk downtown. They will see the new buildings and the old ones side by side. They will stop at the museum and look at the photographs. They will visit the memorial park and read the names. And they will tell stories. The story of the couple who survived in their bathtub, the story of the firefighter who carried a child to safety, the story of the neighbor who shared his tools and his time, the story of a town that refused to give up. That is the legacy of the Xenia tornado. It is not just a chapter in weather history. It is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. It is a reminder that even in our darkest hour, we are not alone. We have each other, and that is enough. In the years that followed, the stories of that day took on a life of their own. They were told and retold, each time with a new detail, a new lesson. The children who survived grew up and had children of their own, and they made sure the next generation understood what had happened. They did not want the memory to fade, because in the memory there was strength. One of those children was a boy named Michael, who had been just 2 years old when the tornado struck. He had no memory of the event itself, only the stories his mother told him. She described how she had covered him with a mattress in the bathroom, how she had held him tight while the house shook around them. Michael grew up hearing that story, and it shaped the way he saw the world. He became a carpenter by trade, and he took special care when building houses to make sure they were sturdy. He always told his clients that a strong foundation was not just good building practice, it was a promise to protect the ones you loved. He would often say, "I build homes for people the way my mother built a shelter for me, with everything I have." The tornado also influenced the way the city planned for the future. After the recovery effort settled, Xenia's leaders looked at the patterns of destruction and realized that some neighborhoods were more vulnerable than others. They studied the path of the tornado and saw how it had followed a low area, how it had been funneled by the hills. They used that knowledge to update the city's zoning laws, requiring new homes in certain areas to have reinforced safe rooms. They planted windbreaks of trees and designed public buildings with interior shelters. The school board redesigned the new school buildings, first to have reinforced corridors and windowless rooms that could serve as shelters. The fire department, which had been overwhelmed by the number of calls on April 3rd, conducted a study of their response times and created a new system for dispatching resources during a major emergency. By the time the next decade came, Xenia was not only a city that had survived a tornado, it was a city that had become a model for disaster preparedness. But the personal stories remained the most powerful legacy. Take the example of Margaret, a woman who had been 34 years old when the tornado destroyed her home. She and her husband had lost everything. They had moved in with relatives for a time, then rented a small apartment, and finally built a new house on the same lot as their old one. Margaret planted a rose garden on that lot in the exact spot where her living room had been. She said it was a way of beautifying the place where her family had once gathered. Every spring, the roses bloomed in deep red and pale pink, and she would cut a few stems and place them on the graves of her neighbors who had died. She did that for 40 years, until she passed away in 2014. Her daughter carried on the tradition. When people asked why she did it, she said, "My mother taught me that you don't forget the ones you love. You keep them alive in your heart and you keep their memory in your hands." There were also the stories of strangers who became friends. One of the most remarkable was about two families who had never met before the tornado. The Williams family's house had collapsed on top of them, but they were pulled out by a man named James who had been driving by in his pickup truck. James did not know the Williams family, but he spent hours digging through the rubble with his bare hands, cutting himself on broken glass and splintered wood. He got the whole family out, father, mother, and two children, and then he disappeared. The Williams family tried to find him, but they had no name, no address. Years later, at a community event, the teenage son, now grown, spotted a man with a scar on his arm. The scar matched the description his father had given of the rescuer. The young man walked up and said, "Are you the man who saved my family?" The man, James, was startled. He had never told anyone about that day. He had simply gone home, cleaned up his wounds, and gotten on with his life. The two families embraced, and from that day on they celebrated every April 3rd together, sharing a meal and remembering the moment that had brought them together. It was a friendship born from tragedy, but it was as real and enduring as any bond could be. The tornado also left its mark on the arts in Xenia. A local poet, inspired by the stories of survival, wrote a series of verses called The Green Sky Season. Those poems were later set to music by a composer from Cincinnati, and they were performed at the Xenia Arts Center on the anniversary of the storm. The performance became an annual tradition, with each year's rendition moving a new audience to tears. A painter named Alina, who had been a teenager when the tornado hit, created a mural on the side of a downtown building that showed the tornado approaching, its funnel cloud reaching down like a finger toward the courthouse. In the foreground, she painted figures reaching out to each other, hands clasped, faces turned toward the storm but not fleeing. The mural was called Love in the Face of Rage, and it became a landmark. Tourists would stop to photograph it, and locals would point it out to their children, saying, "That's us, that's who we are." The science, too, continued to evolve because of what happened on April 3rd. Every new study of tornado formation drew on data from that day. Meteorologists used the Xenia tornado as a case study for understanding how storms interact with terrain. They noted how the tornado had strengthened as it crossed the city, and they theorized that the urban heat island effect might have contributed to its intensity. That insight led to further research on how large cities can affect weather patterns. The National Weather Service also used the timeline of that storm to improve its warning systems. They realized that the time between a warning and impact could be shortened if they had better coordination with local spotters. So they created a network of amateur radio operators, known as the Skywarn program. which trained volunteers across the country to report severe weather in real time. Xenia's spotter network became one of the first certified groups in the nation, and their reports were used to confirm tornadoes before they ever appeared on radar. And yet, for all the progress, the most profound changes were in the hearts of the people. Those who had been through the tornado carried a certain perspective that those who had not could never fully understand. They knew that everything could be taken away in a moment. They knew that the things that mattered most were not things at all. They knew that a hand on your shoulder in the dark meant more than any possession. And they carried that knowledge into every aspect of their lives. They were more likely to stop and help a stranded motorist. They were more likely to invite a lonely neighbor to dinner. They were more likely to forgive a slight because they understood that anger was a waste of the time we had been given. As the 50th anniversary approached, the city prepared for a commemoration that would be both solemn and joyful. The planning committee, made up of survivors and their children, decided to do something new this time. They would not only remember the dead but also honor the living. They created a wall of gratitude at the community center, where people could write thank you notes to the volunteers, the first responders, and the strangers who had helped during the recovery. The wall filled up within days. Notes thanked the woman who had offered her kitchen to cook hot meals. They thanked the man who had driven a truck full of donated clothing from Georgia. They thanked the family who had let a homeless family stay in their home for 2 months. The wall was a testament to the kindness that had flowed into Xenia from all over the country, and to the kindness that flowed out from the people of Xenia to each other. On the actual anniversary date, April 3, 2024, the weather was warm and clear. The sky was blue with only a few puffy white clouds, no sign of a storm. It was as if nature itself was paying its respects. The ceremony began at 4:30 in the afternoon, just minutes before the clock's frozen hands. The courthouse lawn was filled with people. Some had brought lawn chairs, others stood, their eyes fixed on the tower. A choir sang Amazing Grace. A local minister spoke about the fragility of life and the strength of community. Then the mayor stepped to the podium. He was a man in his 40s, born years after the tornado, but he had grown up with its stories. He said, "We are not defined by the storm. We are defined by what we did when the storm passed. We are defined by the way we helped each other, the way we rebuilt, the way we kept going. That is the legacy of Xenia." At precisely 4:41, the city's new emergency sirens were not sounded. Instead, a single bell from the courthouse tower was rung 33 times, once for each life lost. The crowd stood in silence. Many wept, some held hands. A few people placed flowers around the base of the clock tower. Then, as the last bell faded, the crowd began to sing. They sang America the Beautiful, and then they sang a local folk song that had been written in the days after the tornado, a simple tune with lyrics about standing together. The melody was passed down through the years, known by heart even to those who had never heard it before. After the ceremony, the crowd did not disperse quickly. They lingered, they talked, they hugged, they told stories. An elderly couple described how they had met in the shelter of a collapsed grocery store. They had been holding hands ever since. A young mother pointed to a scar on her arm and said she had gotten it while running through broken glass to find her grandmother. She showed her own small child the scar and said, "That's a reminder to be brave." The child looked at the scar and then at the courthouse clock and said, "Mom, why is the clock stuck?" The mother smiled and said, "Because some moments are too important to forget." And that, in the end, is the final lesson of the Xenia tornado. The clock is stuck. Time moves on, but the moment remains. The storm came and went. The city crumbled and rose again. The people wept and then they laughed. The scars are there, but they are also badges of honor. The story is told and it will be told again. And the spirit of Xenia, the spirit that refused to break, continues to shine in every act of kindness, every rebuilt home, every spring garden, every hand held in the dark. The tornado of April 3, 1974 changed Ohio forever. But it did not break the people of Xenia. It made them stronger, closer, and more aware of the preciousness of every moment. And as long as the clock reads 4:41, that truth will never be forgotten.